It's very
Okay.
important because if you don't talk about containers, China wouldn't exist. Contemporary China wouldn't exist. Deng Xiaoping wouldn't have succeeded. None of that would be possible if it weren't for the ISO container standard, which is the thing that enabled the global manufacturing economy. We've got this crazy thing right now where the most legitimate rules that we have for dealing with some of the most important environmental changes, for some of the most important human rights problems, particularly uh, questions about common labor standards, are standards that have been developed not by governments, but by the ISO.
Mostly because the U.S. won't sign.
Yeah, mostly because the U.S. has for 40 years backed away from uh, engaging in any treaty making about the problems that are caused by our contemporary global economy.
Standards, they're important. What are they? What's the deep history? To explore, we have the first couple of global standard studies, Joanne Yates and Craig Murphy, whose recent book, Engineering Rules, Global Standard Setting Since 1880. Yes, that is 1880, not 1980, was a fantastic introduction to the wonderful, wacky, and increasingly politicized world of global standardization. Today, I have with me
Jacob, a junior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.
welcome to Try and Talk, everyone.
So you start the book with the first standardization activities in the late 1800s. What were these activities and how did they eventually lead to the creation of the IEC?
So there were initially some activities within individual engineering societies in different countries. There was also an attempt by testing materials engineers, academics, to get together across country lines in the background too. But there was a lot of this national level societies. And then there was the IEC grew out of this.
Oh, yeah, a set of electrical engineers. So the testing materials engineers were interested in testing the steel that went into steel rails, connecting things from one place to another. But electrical engineers, by which we don't mean computer engineers, we mean people who were engineering the electric lines that connected one place to another, power plants to the little light bulbs. What a great idea. They decided in 1904 that, wow, we need standards for all of those electrical systems that are going to exist around the world so that the power plants can connect to the wires and the wires can connect to your home and the wires in your home can connect to the electric light bulbs.
I think that this whole movement, the scientists, the electrical scientists, had been defining terms for a while, meeting occasionally in international get-togethers and defining terms. But they were the ones who suggested that maybe the electrical engineers should actually create an association across these countries so they could make it so that they could actually transmit electricity across lines and things like that.
And they meant to create this at the St. Louis World's Fair, which you all know is a place where the ice cream cone was invented.
I have two threads to throw at you, and you can pick one or the other or both. Elting Morrison, From Know-How to Nowhere. Does this book ring a bell at all for you guys?
But I haven't read it.
Okay. So in the sort of early chapters, so Elting Morrison, more famous for Men, Machines, and Modern Times. This is another kind of short collection of his MIT, right? I think. Anyways, so he has these fantastic chapters of American engineers in the early 19th century, sort of slowly figuring out how to build dams and canals and railroads basically on their own. And the kind of knowledge transfer would be like, they would send a letter to a British guy and there would be like some like nice British engineer who every once in a while would say like, oh, you should use like this kind of mud, not that kind of mud, because I've built like 50 canals and I know that like this kind of mud is a disaster and will like make it fall apart. And in sort of watching that slow kind of institutionalization of engineering knowledge where, everyone who works on the Erie Canal kind of gets that like firsthand training. And once you kind of build that, you build those friend groups of people who are, living in the forest for 20 years together, then you start kind of getting more and more sort of knowledge transfer as well as institutionalization, because these, as you said, these folks are friends. They want to engage with other folks and they want to learn what's going on from the rest of the world. So I'm curious, like, even going back before the 1880s, to what extent did you have this sort of national as well as international engineering knowledge transfer? And what do you think was the tipping point that led this stuff to start to get institutionalized?
So I think that the tipping point was the professionalization of engineering fields. The fact that they started seeing themselves as professionals. And one of the characteristics of professionals as they were seen then was that A, they were supposed to be gentlemen, and I do mean gentlemen and not ladies. And they were supposed to
do something in the public
Right.
service.
in the public.
So doctors were allowed to be gentlemen because actually making people healthy was okay. Barristers were allowed to be gentlemen, supposedly. It's hard to say that they ever were. Lawyers were allowed to be gentlemen because they were contributing to legislation and the public good and conflict resolution and that sort of thing. And engineers wanted to be gentlemen, like professors who were already gentlemen, and
They wanted to
contribute to the
have
public
something-
good.
Right. They wanted to have something they could do for the public good. And they recognized that standard setting was something they could do. One of the things that triggered it, for example, in the US, steamboats, the boilers exploded.
Steam boilers blew up a lot.
And it was really horrific. You don't want to hear what happened to all the people on the steamboats. It was just horrific. So it was one of the things that a group of engineers and scientists at the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia in the US decided that they were going to come up with standards to keep this from happening.
Figure out how thick the boilerplate should be before it blows up.
Right.
And then you write that down and you write the boilerplate down about the boilerplate and you've got a standard.
And then the Germans, the German standards setting body, its first standard was the same thing. It was boilers, steam boilers. So, there was this sense of you could help with some public safety things, but quickly, actually, they turned away from just doing things like that for public safety and started into doing standardizing for industrialization, for, pieces of industrial equipment, for all kinds of things, screw threads. Probably it's the iconic thing that you standardize with the threads of screws, because it used to be that whatever machinist made your machine had a one-of-a-kind screw. So if you lost a screw, you had to go back to him to get that replaced. And at a certain point, there became some desire to be able to go to someone else for that screw. So trying to get a standard screw thread was incredibly important.
It's still important. Yeah.
So another thread I want to throw at you. Mona Hathaway, Ian Shapiro, the internationalists. I don't know if this is
Yes.
Get it.
Cute, not me.
That's me. Yep.
The sort of, so this book, which was, might have been the first podcast I ever did on China Talk. Go back in the archives, folks.
Oh my God.
Had a real, a great illustration of the same era of like pre-World War I, all of these gentlemanly men meeting around the world, outlawing war, I guess pre and post World War I, and kind of thinking that sort of international cooperation and like people, as you said, speaking civilly to each other and sitting in rooms for a long period of time could like reach, outcomes that Thucydides would think was impossible. I'm curious, to what extent did those sort of like international peace and like global development strains intersect?
Well, they intersect. I mean, there's a great book by a guy named Murphy called International Organization and Industrial Change, 1994, which links these two things. And it turns out that conferences about international cooperation of different sorts started after the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. And they would have these conferences of the great powers, and they would come together and talk about how we could make sure that the world would be just run by us. But at the same time, you started to have uh, social movement organizations and even crazy different types of private organizations meet at the same time as the great powers are meeting. And that's where you actually started to get the first scientists coming around and sitting around and saying, let's define the different electrical terms that we're going to use. But it's also when you got the Esperanto people coming together and figuring out, let's create a world language. And it's when you got organizations like the international law associations, who were these crazy people who thought we could have something called international law that would actually make peace instead of determining just how people should kill each other. So they're all meeting actually at the same kinds of places.
So moving on to the second wave of standardization, you wrote this really fascinating section on standardization during World War II, where you illustrate the massive costs that the Allies incurred because their screws, their spark plugs, their rifles and ammunition, they didn't fit together, and they were manufactured to different standards in each country. So I'm just curious, did Germany and Italy encounter similar challenges on the Axis?
Oh, that's a really good
What a
question.
good question.
That's a really good
You know, we
question.
didn't look at
We
that.
didn't really look at it, but there's no reason to think they didn't. Yeah,
I don't know where we would find archives that would show that. It would be fascinating.
we do know one thing though. The the German speaking international standardizer who sort of preserved an attempt, an interwar attempt to create a global standardization organization, Mr. Huberhoff. Mr. Huberhoff was kind of a proto-fascist and was given wonderful medals by Mussolini, which suggests, although it was Swiss, which is an odd part about this, but it suggests to me that perhaps there was a little bit more interdiscussion between the Italians and the Germans than there was.
It's a good question, and I wish I knew the answer.
Yeah.
I think it became so clear the US and British problems were widely discussed in Congress and other places like that, which is why we know so much about them.
Right.
I'm pretty sure in Adam Tooze's Wages of Destruction, he has a little riff on how Germany was actually really, really late to standardization, and maybe they got with the within Germany. So maybe they had got with the program by World War II, but that was
Yeah, they
Yes.
by World War II.
They had it.
So they were behind initially,
We're very much behind.
but then they kind of jumped ahead at a
Yes.
certain point. They made standards much more rapidly, and they were very systematic, and they shared their standards with the Soviet
The Soviet Union in the interwar period, and that's what part of how the Soviet Union was able to industrialize as quickly as it did.
That's fantastic. I was wondering if maybe could you tell us the story? It seems like we're leading into this. Could you tell us the story of how the ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, was negotiated in those years following World War II?
You want to start?
Yeah, I guess I could start. So the Allies, in particular the British and the Americans, were more obsessed about the fact that their inner workings were not. It just wasn't taking place terribly well. Partially because the troops and the planes and all that sort of those two allies were working on in the same places in the Western Front rather than the Eastern Front. And they started to have a series of meetings in New York and in Canada to figure out what a post-war truly international organization would look like. And they quickly brought in most of the Allied members organizations that were standardization associations, and Allies was understood more broadly. It was understood as all of the members of the United Nations, which is what the alliance was called, which included a number of Latin American countries, of course. and of course the Soviet Union. Um, and then there was a big question of how many of the neutrals and which neutrals during the war would you bring in? And it was real easy to decide that you needed to bring in the Swiss and the Swedes. They're kind of big in high technology. And because of the way the war ended, it was okay to bring in the Italians pretty quickly. But it was a little bit harder to bring in the Spanish, who were neutral, but not really neutral. There were little difficulties of this sort, but they held a number of meetings. Ultimately, in 1946 in London, really at the same time as the first meeting of the United Nations, which was also in London in 1946, they held a meeting that created the International Organization for Standardization. And then they very quickly after that, they started to make relations with some of the former German standardizers who were becoming um, anti-Nazi very quickly, and trying to make sure that they had a truly global organization. Um, and they set up headquarters in Geneva next to the International Electrotechnical Commission, and everything was just fine.
So it was interesting, actually, the location, the pick of Geneva. Geneva, they voted several cycles of votes trying to agree on where they should be headquartered, and they beat Montreal by one vote finally. So it could have been in Montreal,
Yeah. So,
but
and it was it was very nice because one of the people who is still pushing all of this, who is one of our favorite electrical engineers in the whole story, is this chap from Great Britain, although actually from the Channel Islands, named Charles Lemaistre, who was fluent in French and British and English from the very beginning, and he had long been the general secretary of the International Electrotechnical Commission
I
and
can see.
of the IEC, and he pushed for making sure the ISO was going to take place and be created, and he then was involved with the ISO also as kind of a transitional figure until his death in 1953. But he kind of covered the whole early period.
And you brought up this point that they wanted it to be truly international. And I'm curious, to what extent did they succeed in those early days?
They actually brought in the Germans very well and early because they knew the German standardizers. Actually, the leading figure of the German standardizers actually led the committee of self-reflection for German engineers, in which they castigated themselves for having followed the Nazi thing, and he led that whole effort. And then, I mean, they all knew him. They all could work with him. The Germans were invited to
Both Germans.
to sit in on the meetings even before they were officially allowed back in. There were still arguments because Belgium, for example, really objected to
You could
having,
understand why they were.
right, for obvious political reasons. But the heart of this movement believed in internationalism and that you have to have all the stakeholders at the table, no matter who they are. And for industrialization, Germany was a stakeholder. You couldn't
Right.
ignore it.
So
And it did work.
becoming more truly international. I mean, if you see the earliest thing in 1946, the number of country members that existed at the time was similar to the number of national members of the United Nations. But decolonization is taking place as well.
Right.
And in a way, the ISO was ahead of decolonization, just as it was sort of ahead of in making peace. So the ISO had, even though it was formed in 1946, had an Indian member, because there were Indian engineers who were ready to go into an organization of this sort. Actually, Palestine was represented at the first ISO conference, and there were two sets of engineers in the Palestinian delegation, as you might imagine. But again, Palestine was certainly a colony at that point, and Israel, which is still a member of the ISO, is considered a founding member, even though there was certainly no Israel yet.
So you write about Ole Suren, who, as general secretary of the ISO, sought to expand the pace and scope of international standardization. And Surin must have traveled to dozens of countries as general secretary, but you specifically call out his 2 trips to China in
Yeah.
1976 and 78. What was so significant about these trips?
Well, China, after the Chinese Revolution, dropped out of, or was, one could say, excluded, but more, it was more the case that actually they didn't participate in either the IEC or the ISO. They came back into under the communist government, came back into the IEC, the electrical engineers, by 1957. But in the general standardization organization, there wasn't strong Chinese interest until Deng Xiaoping came to power and became very concerned about China becoming a major player in the global economy. And Steren went to China immediately after, well, immediately before and immediately after, in a sense. He was already promoting the idea of Chinese membership in 1976, and he led the change in government to help Chinese engineers who were interested in rejoining ISO to immediately.
Yeah. So it was accepted, China was accepted into into ISO in 1977. And he went there in 76 and then again in 78 to kind of solidify the relationship.
Should we move on to the third wave, or do you have anything else you want to talk about in the second wave?
What, no containers?
We really should talk about containers in the second wave. It's very
Okay.
important, because if you don't talk about containers, China wouldn't exist. Contemporary China wouldn't exist. Deng Xiaoping wouldn't have succeeded. None of that would be possible if it weren't for the ISO container standard, which is the thing that enabled the global manufacturing economy. And it was also Steren, when he came into ISO at the very beginning, he had sort of like 4 or 5 things that he wanted to do. He wanted to make sure there were standards bodies everywhere in the world, and he wanted to make sure that there were standards associated with some new or possibly opening technologies. One of which was the computer. Crazy idea that would be a global technology of some sort when you're sitting around in 1960. And then the second technology was the container. The idea, he was a Swede, right? So he cared about the water and all that sort of stuff. But the idea that we could ship goods in these little metal boxes, and every ship wouldn't have to have 250,000 separate little packages brought in and brought out. And you'd have these great big boxes, and you could lower the costs of shipping globally. That was one of Steren's major concerns. His last major concern, by the way, was standards for the environment. He must have known that once we had all of those containers and the internet, that we would destroy the oceans and destroy the atmosphere, and it would be good to have anyway.
Do you want to tell us a little bit more about the creation of shipping container standards? And when I was reading that section, for example, the part that I found particularly fascinating was how they negotiated this disagreement, I think, in the length of the shipping container. Yeah, do you want to maybe tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So the whole attempt to standardize containers started in the US. And there were 2 companies that were who had already come up with proprietary standards just for their own fleets of containers, one with 35-foot containers and one with 24-foot containers. But when the committee was brought together, there were committees that had, there were committees looking at the dimensions, committees looking at the wall strength, all kinds of things, how you hook them together,
Corners, yeah.
and so on. But the dimensions one, the person heading it got it into his head that he really liked the idea of having them be 20 and 40. And then you could also make the 10 and 30 standards so that any combination of 10, 20, 30, and 40, you could if you had 40 feet on the truck, you could put any combination of the others. So he decided, he sort of pushed and thought this was very rational. And ultimately, everyone agreed on this 10, 20, 30, 40 standard for links. And the problem was that, these two companies that already existed had, it made theirs obsolete in one sense. Although they could still use them independently by themselves, they wouldn't get the advantage of having them circulating in the world, which is a big advantage overall. So they lost. But even though they lost, that to me, the fascinating part of the story is that after they lost, at a later stage, when they were doing they were standardizing the corners that held together containers on a ship. When you stack stacks of those containers up, they had to be fastened at the corners. And at a certain point in that process, both in the national and the international standards process, they looked at the available corners and they argued and argued. And the one that everyone liked best was the one used by one of those two companies. But they wanted it to be a slightly different dimension because the dimensions were different, but they wanted that. But it was patented. And so one of the people on the committee who had formerly worked with that company and had helped design those corners went back to the owner and asked him, can you please give up the patent right to this so we can take it and
Put it into the standard.
and put it in the standards. We have to change the dimensions, but then put it into the standards. And amazingly enough, he agreed. And so he gave up that patent completely. The company and the guy gave up the patent. That patent was abrogated, and they used that standard. It became an open standard for these corners. So,
All right. Finally, we've talked about the IEC, we've talked about the ISO, and finally we get to the third wave of standard setting organizations that emerged in response to computer networking and accompanied the acceleration of technological change. And so in what ways did these organizations differ from their predecessors?
so IETF was the first one of these, and it was sort of an accidental standard setting organization. It was not created to be an official standard setting organization, but when DARPA spun off the internet, the civilian internet, they helped them just establish this two-tier system with some general strategy committees, a general strategy committee, and then a committee of people who could work on the standards, but they didn't see themselves as any big deal. And then because in a standards war, that the internet standard, TCP/IP, which connects all the internet nodes, that actually came to the top, rose to the top, and became the de facto standard because the efforts in ISO were taking too long and got terminally bogged down. So the companies, the little companies out there, were desperate to start making money on products around the internet. So they actually started defaulting to this TCP/IP, and so it became the de facto standard. And then IETF,
Internet Engineering Task Force.
became the de facto standard setter. Now, it differed in a few important ways from the other standards organizations. The other standards organization, so first of all, it had no official membership. IETF's rules still say that anyone can come to a meeting. There's no
We've been to IETF meetings, and what do we know about electric engineering?
So, there, first of all, no membership. And they believe in what they call rough consensus and running code. So rough consensus they say you don't have to have complete consensus. You don't have to go through this very long process that the traditional ones do to make sure everyone has gotten their say. You just have to have rough consensus. They don't vote, they hum to see which group hums louder is one of their ways of judging consensus. So they're a little weird on that one too. And in general, they considered themselves extremely democratic for all these reasons. The odd thing is that from our point of view, there's one thing missing that I think is a potential problem. And that is they don't have a rule that you have to have a balance of stakeholders. So if you look at any of the other standards organizations, they demand that you have a balance. So the easiest form of balance, which was what they originally had in a lot of them, was you had to have the producers, the buyers, the customers, and unaffiliated engineers who could stand for the public good. And there was no longer a requirement for that in IETF. Anyone could go to any meeting. So it is, at least in theory, possible for example, Microsoft to send hundreds of its engineers to a particular meeting where they really cared about the outcome.
Allowed us.
Yeah, and win a standard they wanted. So, it's interesting in a lot of ways. The other thing that's very much a contrast between the IETF and the other ones we talked about, if you look at IEC and ISO, you get the top hats in the early period, and you get suits and ties in the middle period. And IETF was sandals and T-shirts and shorts. It had a much more rough and tumble style of discussion.
And it's dominated more than the other organizations now. It tends to be dominated by young men
That's typical.
who are engineers that went to a small number of sets of universities, like your own Carnegie Mellon, that happen,
And my MIT.
and Joanne's MIT, that happen to be in the global north. They think of themselves as being incredibly, incredibly democratic, but they have none of the kinds of things that Ole Steren wanted to make sure, which was that there would be people sitting in the meetings representing the people of Africa. There'd be people sitting in the meetings representing rural people of Brazil, etc. They might be the one engineer from the rural, but they would be there. So it's quite different in that.
Yeah. Do you want to hear about W3C, or was IETF enough?
Let's do it. W3C.
Oh, well, it's different.
So W3C is an interesting case. I did a closer case study of it and actually participated, sort of, observed at least all of their meetings, all of their phone meetings, and read all of their emails for a 5-year period to follow one particular standards committee through. And it was a fascinating process.
It's the important committee, the Committee for Web Cryptography Standards. So, big deal.
Do you think you could provide just like a 1-sentence summary or something of web cryptography just for the listeners?
Web Crypto API? Yeah. Okay. The particular committee I looked at was the Web Cryptography API Working Group. And they were trying to make a standard API, an interface for computer programmers and users in which you could create cryptographic systems for different. So each company might use these tools and then create security for their particular application. So it was a toolkit for security.
Yeah.
And but W3C is an interesting case because it as a committee is quite different, as an organization is quite different from IETF. First of all, it's a consortium. So it borrowed something that had also been going on in this period. As technology started changing faster and faster, companies started bypassing some of the standards organizations because they took so long, and they came together in their own consortia and made some decisions and came up with something, and then tried to sell it to the rest of the world. W3C calls itself a consortium, and there are paying members, just as in these other ones. Companies are paying members, organizations too. But they are different from those consortia, in most consortia like that, in that they're open to any organization that wants to be part of it, and they have a sliding scale in dues. So the big company might have started out at 50,000, but little things started out at 5,000. So, they made it more accessible. They also created a set of rules that look actually surprisingly like the rules and the stages of a traditional standard setting body like ANSI, which is the American.
And they're even converging over time. So
they become more similar over time. So they look very similar, and they are not, well, I can say from experience that a lot of the people who come to these meetings wear jeans and t-shirts. They don't have quite the wild kind of meetings that go on with IETF. They're a little more staid in their style.
And the one of the other things that's like the older organizations.
Wait, what's a wild IETF meeting? Let's stay on that for a second.
Oh, wow.
What's the word I'm trying to come up with?
I don't know what the word is you're trying to come up with.
We talked about freewheeling.
Freewheeling.
That's a
Freewheeling. That's a good way to put it rather than wild.
So IETF was known for having freewheeling meetings where people would use all kinds of language that would not be accepted in polite society in the older traditional ones. And they often had what one of my people in W3C referred to as sharp elbows. And they would
People get yelled down and told they're stupid, and
Right. So it's really a much more aggressive style of interacting in IETF. And W3C is not quite that aggressive typically, although, what in the particular committee I looked at, we did see some of that aggression only in email from one person. So there was a point where it almost became a flame war, and it had to be the chair of the committee had to tell them to stop all communication for 3 days so that they could get their tempers back in check. But W3C, I think, is a little bit more organizationally coherent than IETF is. And it does have some.
That's an understatement.
Yeah. And it does have some rules about, a few more rules about balance than the IETF has. So, but it's funny that the electrical engineers, the computer scientists and engineers who are on the committees, they both consider in the third wave, what we find is that it's not that these people are devoted to standardization in its own right, which the earlier two stages were. They are in this because they believe in the internet, or they believe in the web. And so now the devotion has shifted from standardization per se to the technology that they're trying to standardize. They think they're helping the world by helping make the internet and the web a better place.
The other thing about W3C is that it is, that IETF talks about having no kings or blah, 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 blah. W3C was invented by Tim Berners Lee. He was the one who created the code for the web in the first place and gave it away free. He's a real believer, true believer. And he created the standardization organization, and he made himself the king. that because there's an appeal process that exists within W3C, and the appeal process, this will change over time, but the appeal process is to Tim Berners Lee.
Right. So yes, that's the most unusual thing about W3C, that Tim Berners Lee himself has more control than any individual has in any of the other traditional or otherwise. But as he said, a good king sets up a bureaucracy and then steps back and lets it run itself. And most of the time, I think he does succeed in doing that. I don't know that it's all the time, but and I don't know what I don't know, but I could tell that, he does seem to be most of the time try to stay out of the weeds.
Benevolent overlord.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And every once in a while it's useful to have. There's another set of issues which are adopting the standard setting mode for the first time because we don't have any other options right now. You want to talk a little bit about environmental?
Yeah, I mean, to go back to Ole Sturen, way back in the 60s, he was saying, okay, we have to have computers, we have to have shipping containers, we have to make sure everybody in the world is there. But he also said we have to do things like the environment. And we've got this crazy thing right now where the most legitimate rules that we have for dealing with some of the most important environmental changes for some of the most important human rights problems, particularly uh, questions about common labor standards, are standards that have been developed not by governments, but by the ISO.
Mostly because the U.S. won't sign.
Yeah, mostly because the U.S. has for 40 years backed away from uh, engaging in any treaty making about the problems that are caused by our contemporary global economy. So you've got to find something else, and what ISO does looks like a better way to do it.
Well, at least it's the only game.
It's the only game in
Yeah.
town.
I mean, it's not perfect. It's not great, but it does do a little bit of good, and that's more than anything else is doing now. So
at the end, right in the last chapter of the book, we talk at one point about how John Lewis, the kind of civil rights icon, great labor union leader, ends up near the end of his life being convinced by a standard setter from ANSI that he should have congressional hearings about how what has, since the time the book was finished, has become the global ISO standard for labor conditions, how that should be something that the United States as a government is embracing. And when you think about it, to have someone like Lewis who really would want there to be laws or things enforced by unions saying that the best that we can come up with is the sort of thing that comes out of the ISO. It's somewhat depressing,
significant.
but significant because it actually is at least something. Yeah.
So we've come all the way now from the late 1800s all the way to the present. And I was hoping to ask a couple of questions kind of focused on this really thorny issue that's emerged of undue influence in international standard setting. And when it comes to standard setting for emerging tech industries, you argue in your book that IETF and W3C and these other third wave standard setting organizations will probably be more influential than the traditional first and second wave players. And maybe that's debatable. But
It's debatable.
I was so do you think these third wave SDOs, again, IETF, W3C, are they more or less able to repel potential undue influence compared to their predecessors? And brought up before the question of balance requirements.
So I think those two, we're not seeing, I have not heard of any undue influence going on in IETF or W3C. And part of the reason is that language, frankly. If you're talking about Chinese undue influence in particular, would I be correct in assuming that's in your question?
Yeah, I think, maybe this is kind of just like an aside here, but I think for that question, kind of just like generally interested about about any form of undue influence, whether or not it's from China. But that's certainly the motivating factor behind the question. Yes.
Yeah. So I think the danger in an IETF is that there could be undue influence from a particular company that floods the meetings with it. But in terms of geopolitical, who has undue influence, at this point, IETF is still, although it's trying to think of itself as global, it's basically a white male Western dominated group of people who are involved in it. So I think W3C has done a little better at trying to bring in Europe and Asia. But the fact is that even though they're better at that, I saw in the committee that I studied that there were 4 Korean members who didn't get to participate much, because of time zone problems. Time zone problems meant that, they would have to come at 3:00 in the morning, and B, because of language skills. They could not speak well enough in this kind of technical setting to get their ideas across. So they didn't have influence in those. I think even if you go to ISO and IEC, I think there part of the problem is that the undue influence is with it. American companies and European companies are not supporting as many of their people to go be part of the standards process as they used to. We need to step up our game to push back, not to have a different game, not to have the government controlling what they say when. It's the companies that need to be sending people to these meetings. In chapter 6 of the book, I talk about the Americans who did radio frequency interference standardizing. They had to learn to participate in European standard setting at that point. Well, I think in some ways, again, we need to, both us and now the Europeans to a lesser extent too, need to put more effort into engaging with these standard setting organizations and pushing back, because the way they can lose is just not sending people and having it. If China, for example, organizes its people, the government tells them what their line is going to be, and then they go in and push that line. Uh, uh, they're not going to win if everyone else is coming in and having their different lines and pushing back. They can't dominate it. The whole system, the traditional system at least, is set up in a way that a given entity can slow down the process, but they can't push their own through if everyone else is participating. But if no one's participating, then you've got a problem.
Yes.
So, yeah, please.
The one place where questions of undue influence is really relevant is in company consortia that are dealing with brand new technologies. And it is possible to imagine, and we've had some examples of this, where when amount to company consortia that are concerned with things like 5G, have a situation where one government, let's call it China, is informing Chinese firms that happen to be part of the consortia that they all must kind of vote for parts of a standard that are those that are coming from and benefit a particular Chinese firm. And that is, consortia are all these kind of new types of organizations. Their legal status is usually as a company existing under the law of one country or another. Maintaining a rule that all of the companies are truly independent within a consortium is a very, very difficult thing to do. That's a real issue. A lot of the other things that people talk about as issues of undue influence, traditionally American companies would say, and this is a reasonable thing, that in many ISO type meetings, the problem that you sometimes run into is the Europeans, because the European Union essentially makes sure that there is coherence and in standard setting in Europe, and that there really is the equivalent of one European standard, and they get 20 votes. And then
that's what the American
companies are the most likely going to be talking about, because the United States gets one vote. That's a real issue. Some big people deal with it. Things like finding that suddenly the directors, the people who have the presidency, which is kind of an honorary title in things like the ISO, happens to suddenly be Chinese.
That's it.
Is not a really big deal. I mean, that job isn't a terribly important job. Anyway,
the person who's important
is the executive director,
right? Is the executive director. So the Ole Stearns and the Charles Lemaistres that we talk about in the book, they aren't the ones that they're not president for 1 year or 2 years. They're
there for a decade.
They're the deputy. They're the secretary that runs the whole thing for decades at a time.
You can see that some Americans and Europeans are surprised now that we have had some executive directors who are from Japan or China, and that's new.
We haven't had any. ISO doesn't yet have an neither of the big ones have had a Chinese executive director. I think that's not.
No, but ITU-T has, and
Yeah. But so ITU is different though. I mean,
in it government.
right. We have to keep that in mind. It's a different kind of organization. ITU is intergovernmental, and it has this set of standards bodies by the side of it.
That operate in a very similar way.
Yeah, that imitate the ISOs and IECs and how they operate, but it's the government who determines who's on that committee. And that makes it inherently different than ISO, where the U.S. delegation to ISO is the government has nothing to do with it. It's the ANSI, or going down another level, if it's a committee around a electrical thing, it would be the IEEE that would have the choice. So it's technically driven rather than governmentally driven.
What happens if this all falls apart? If
Ooh,
if we end up having so much politicization and so much kind of government attention and focus that the magic of these organizations and the globalization which has been able to be unlocked through these organizations ends up starting to reverse.
I think there is a danger to that, and I think that's the inflection point in this third wave that and I don't know which way it's going to go yet, but it does worry me because there is the chance that if this system falls apart, you need something new. Now, some people would argue that having governments be more involved isn't necessarily a bad thing. So, for example, with global warming, some people would argue that until we get the governments in there and actually mandating things, it can't be enough. So there may be realms in which,
in fact,
it's a good thing.
Many of the new areas, environment, human rights, etc., are probably better if governments are actually involved in them. The problem with technical standards is governments aren't very good at it.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't have the expertise. It's, just think about it for a moment. The governments are not going to be hiring for and sitting in government ministries people who have the highest technical knowledge of different fields. They just don't have that. And the other thing is that for democratic governments have always hated setting standards because somebody loses. When a standard gets set, there's going to be some company somewhere or farmers in your state or whatever who are going to have built things to a different standard, and suddenly those things will be worth a little bit less. That's why, there's sort of the basic American standard story is that the Constitution has right in it that the United States government is supposed to be concerned about at least measurement standards and other related things, implying industrial standards. Washington went to Congress and in his first address and said, one of the things you need to do right now is get all those standards. And Congress has never wanted to do that because somebody's ox gets gored if standards are met. And that's true in other democratic countries as well. So the likelihood is if the current set of systems that we have fall apart, the standards are not going to get set. That's really what the likelihood is. And if the standards, if the ideology of the old standard setters is at all correct, that means that probably the economy is not going to work as well.
Could you tell us a bit about Wang Ping and Chinese standard setters?
Sure. So Wang Ping is a person who is in his 60s, late 60s, early 70s, who is deeply respected by people across the standard setting community in China. He has had a long career in the official government standards organization. He's done standard setting in computer areas and in quality control areas. And he himself is like one of the great historians of standard setting
in China.
in the world. I mean, hey, not just because he's very good at this stuff. He's a colleague of ours, certainly in that little part of his life. And he talks about the way in which in China there is, a process of moving toward a different kind of standardization system that has been typical of all of the countries that move from being middle income societies to being one of the major industrial powers. And South Korea, for example, has gone through this process. Japan has gone through that process earlier, where it sort of starts out as a somewhat government mandated idea of standard setting, turns into a system that is supposed to be a stakeholder standard setting system where the companies actually operate. And then you start thinking about, well, how are our standards going to play in the world? We're actually going to be part of this game of creating international standards. And then you can kind of go back to something the way Ole Steren talks about that, there are different models of what kind of standardization might be in different countries in the world. And for Wang Ping, he says, there is one version of that probably many people in China, including probably himself, although he hasn't said that, is that we would like China to be like Germany. We'd like China to be a place where China is a major global standard setter, primarily because China creates the best standards. That's the German thing. I mean, it's sneaky of those guys to do that. It's just really sneaky. The companies devote a lot of money to it. The system is coordinated with the cooperation of government, in the sense the government doesn't get in the way and put in crazy laws that would make it hard to have a coordinated system. That sort of thing. And German standards often, in many fields, become global standards. I think that's the kind of goal that a number of the standard setting figures in China really want.
And Wang Ping wants to work through organizations like ISO and IEC.
Just like the Germans do.
Right.
Just like the Germans do. Now, there are alternative models, and one of the alternative models, which has never worked, would be the model of trying to somehow impose your standards upon other parts of the world in order to have government try to directly boost their companies by doing that. That's another model.
And I think they sometimes try to do that, but in the long run, that model hasn't tended to work.
We can't point to a case where that's
It's worked in the long run.
But it is a model that one can find people in governments everywhere kind of liking. And right at the moment, I think the terrible thing is that the Chinese government seems to like that model, and the United States has a bunch of people in it who seem to think, "Wow,
We should copy.
we should copy that too. We should be trying to somehow create a system where American company standards, whatever an American company is, are going to be the global standards, and we'll break into markets in that way."
But it's a bad idea. We tried it before.
It was tried in the interwar years. It was tried by Germany, Britain, and the United States together. All three of them tried it a little bit, and
Didn't
work.
So to ask a follow-up on that, the EU just released this standardization strategy.
Which ain't ready yet.
Okay, so maybe that part of the question is not. So to restart here.
I read the executive. Yeah. Anyway.
No, I know the feeling.
You know a lot about the previous round.
Right.
And we know what the listserv says.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Do you feel like the EU is at risk of trying to head in the same direction that the Americans seem to be thinking about?
Well, I haven't seen their latest work on this, but no, I think I don't think so. Do you?
No, I don't think so either. I mean, I think that there is an interest in maintaining the cohesion of the European standard system so that they don't waste time. creating too many, having people create competing standards. I think what has happened in Europe is that what Ole Steren would have called the German system of standard making has become the European system of standard making. That basically the EU has for quite a while been dominated by an idea that we will be the leaders. Our European standards would be the ones that people would want to adopt everywhere and want to turn into ISO standards because they're the best. They can't do that in all fields. That's because nobody, even a place with 500 million people in their market area, doesn't have firms that actually is in a position to have something that looks like the best standard in every field. But it's a strategy. It's a strategy that I could imagine, if they wanted me to come to Washington and tell them what to do, I would say that's probably the strategy that the U.S. should be following. And if China and Europe follow it too, all the better.
Makes a lot of sense.
Uh,
Gordon,
Any final concluding thoughts? Reading list? Life advice?
Jacob, I don't know if you've seen the book by Andy Russell on standards.
I don't know if I have.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very America-centric view. And he admits that, actually, after he read our book, he knows that actually he did leave, he was giving the American one too big a role in comparison to what was going on everywhere else. So it's a very America-centric view, but still, since that's what you're interested in, you might find it interesting.
That if you're interested in the kind of things that Graham is concerned about, which is trying to apply standard setting to areas where government actually should be involved, there is a guy named Harris Gleckman, Gleckman, who is a former UN officer who has written a book that's called something like Stakeholder Standard Setting. I think that's the title. And Gleckman is part of a sort of social movement of people who are really mad at the UN right now for handing over more and more of things that should have been done by treaties to a consensus standard setting system. And it's an interesting group because it includes like labor leaders from all over the world, and mostly democratic countries, Latin America and Europe. It also includes Jeremy Corbyn, the guy who was the leader of the Labour Party in Britain, who was trying to figure out what to do with the rest of his life. And he's decided that one of the things he's going to do with the rest of his life is really get mad at the Secretary General of the United Nations for liking stakeholder standard setting. And even though I'm making it sound like this is a little, that I might disagree with this, I think that this is a group that's making a very, very important point about the limits of stakeholder standards.
To close, we end every episode with a song.
No.
Is there a standards related song?
Whoa, that would be good. Let me think. You should have come up with something because you have them for your class.
No, I do have them
What
for
did
my
you play
class. Yes, I did. So one of the issues about standard setting is the gendered stuff. Peggy Seegers, she's going to be an engineer. And so Peggy Seegers,
And then Pete
Pete Seeger's sister, a song from the 50s about a woman engineer.
Thanks so much for being a part of Chinatown.
Great.
When I was a little girl, I wished I was a boy. I tagged along behind the gang and wore me corduroys. Everybody said I only did it to annoy, but I was gonna be an engineer. Mama told me, can't you be a lady? Your duty is to make me the mother of a pearl. Wait until you're older, dear, and maybe you'll be glad that you're a girl. Dainty as a dressed and statue, gentle as a Jersey cow, smooth as silk gives creamy milk. Learn to coo, learn to moo. That's what you do to be a lady now. When I went to school, I learned to write and how to read, some history, geography, and home economy. And typing is a skill that every girl is sure to need to while away the extra time until the time to breed. Then they had the nerve to say, what would you like to be? I says, I'm gonna be an engineer. No, you only need to learn to be a lady. The duty isn't yours for to try and run the world. An engineer could never have a baby. Remember, dear, that you're a girl. She's smart for a woman. I wonder how she got that way. You get no choice, you get no voice. Just stay mum, pretend you're dumb, and that's how you come to be a lady today. Then Jimmy come along and we set up a congregation. We were busy every night, love and recreation. I spent the day at work so he could get his education. Well, now he's an engineer. He says, I know you'll always be a lady. It's the duty of my darling to love me all her life. Could an engineer look after or obey me? Remember, dear, that you're my wife. Well, as soon as Jimmy got a job, I began again. Then happy at me turret lay the year or so. And then the morning that the twins were born, Jimmy says to them, kids, your mother was an engineer. You owe it to the kids to be a lady. Dainty as a dish rag, faithful as a child. Stay at home, you got to mind the baby. Remember, you're a mother now. Well, every time I turn around, it's something else to do. It's cook a meal, mend a sock, sweep a floor or two. I listening to Jimmy Young, it makes me want to spew. I was gonna be an engineer. Don't I really wish that I could be a lady? I could do the lovely things that a lady's supposed to do. I wouldn't even mind if only they would pay me. And I could be a person too. What price for a woman? You can buy her for a ring of gold. To love and obey without any pay. You get a cook and a nurse, for better or worse. You don't need a purse when the lady is sold. Ah, but now that times are harder and me Jimmy's got the sack, I went down to Vickers, they were glad to have me back. But I'm a third-class citizen, my wages tell me that, and I'm a first-class engineer. The boss, he says, we pay you as a lady. You only got the job cause I can't afford a man. With you I keep the profits highest maybe. You're just a cheaper pair of hands. You got one fault, you're a woman. You're not worth the equal pay. A bitch or a tart, you're nothing but heart. Shallow and vain, you got no brain. You even go down the drain like a lady today. Well, I listened to my mother and I joined a typing pool. I listened to my lover and I put him through his school. But if I listen to the boss, I'm just a bloody fool and an underpaid engineer. I've been a sucker ever since I was a baby, as a daughter, as a wife, as a mother and a dear. But I'll fight them as a woman, not a lady. Fight them as an engineer.